organization that, you guys probably heard that we're being recorded. Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about the organization that is hosting this talk today. So the Service Design Network is a professional organization with chapters worldwide, mostly in Europe and the US and Canada. And it's like AIGA or IXDA or UXPA. It's a professional organization for service designers. The SDN global organization has a great conference coming up in October. They also are, right now, they are doing a member survey across everybody worldwide to get feedback. So even if you're not officially a member or you're not even that familiar with the Service Design Network, I'd encourage you to take the survey so that they can get a broad perspective on what people think about being a service designer and what the global organization and the SF chapter can do to have programming or do whatever it is that we should and could do to help people be better at service design, whatever that means to them. So you can take the survey, you could type in that bit.ly link, it says SDN-Q, or you can use that QR code. I think there's a slide in here about the global conference as well. Yeah, coming up in October in Berlin. So it's usually in Europe. It has been in New York and San Francisco in the past, but that's pretty neat if you can make it out to Berlin. There's also a conference, a virtual online conference aimed more at younger people who are new to service design. It's hosted by the SDN Young Talent Club, and that's available to anybody, so you can sign up there. That's coming up soon in a month. And then Service Design Day is, it's a holiday that the global organization created. I guess it's kind of like the Festival of Shrimp. It's like not a real holiday, but they created it for fun, and that's great. And I don't think we have any programming as far as the Cisco Bay or California area. We don't have anything planned for it yet. So if anybody on this call has an idea of something that would be cool to do to celebrate service design in whatever way, whether it's something virtual or something in person, even just a casual meetup or something, I encourage you to reach out, and you could take that on as a co-host. So I'm going to put a link in the Zoom chat where you can sign up for our email list, and that way you can connect with other people in the SF chapter and reach out to us, the chapter leaders, and yeah, look forward to hearing from you.
All right, thanks, Andrea.
I think that's all I've got. Yeah.
All right, I am very happy today. Thanks everybody for joining. We've got people from Barcelona, from Paris, Madrid, all across the US, Mexico, New York, North Carolina. Anyway, so we're really excited to have so many people joining us today, as well as the locals from the San Francisco Bay Area. And we are really happy to have Sheryl Cababa join us today from Seattle. And Sheryl is a human-centered design practice leader focused on systems thinking and evidence-based design. And she's done all kinds of interesting work in her career, including robotic surgery experience, and then K through 12 education. She's worked with consultancies like Substantial, with Frog, and Adaptive Path, and clients like the Gates Foundation, Microsoft, and IKEA. She has a BA in journalism and political science. What a great combo, from Syracuse University. She's also an international speaker and workshop facilitator. And when she's not in the office, she can be found at the University of Washington teaching the next generation of human-centered design and engineering students, as well as she's an avid bicyclist, not, I think, motorcyclist, and she does complicated baking projects. So that's another interesting angle to her. So welcome to Sheryl. I'm going to stop sharing and we'll let Sheryl speak, because that's what we are all here for. So let me stop sharing. Hang on. Damn. Oh, there it is.
Thanks so much, Bernie. Yeah, honestly, I was telling somebody the other day that the complicated baking projects are, I think they were like a way of like procrastinating when I was writing my book. So I don't know if anyone else is familiar with that term, but it's actually how I like keep myself from doing the tasks that I actually need to do. Amazingly, I did manage to finish it. So that meant I was towards the end, I was baking a little less than I would have liked. Anyway, thank you so much everyone for joining. I'm so thrilled that there's people from all over who've joined today. And so I'm calling in from Seattle. And so before I start, I just kind of want to acknowledge the land that I'm on. So I know we're all from many locations, but in Seattle, I want to acknowledge the Coast Salish people of the land that I'm on, and that includes the Duwamish, Puyallup, Squamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations, lots of tribes here. And I'm always curious about where people are, so feel free to share that in the chat if you know what native land you're on as well. So as Bernie said in her kind introduction, I'm Sheryl. I work at Substantial, which is an independent design and development consultancy primarily based in Seattle, but we have practitioners from all over. And as she mentioned as well, I teach at University of Washington's Human-Centered Design and Engineering School. And lastly, and most relevantly, of course, I'm the author of Closing the Loop, Systems Thinking for Designers, which was released in February. And so hopefully I'd love for any of you to get a chance to read it and to give me any feedback or input that you might find interesting about it. So, I do a lot of thinking about systems thinking, and I feel like there is this mindset involved, like once you start engaging in systems thinking, where you kind of see systems everywhere. And so I'm assuming that some of you have seen this visualization that's been kicking around the internet lately. It shows the highest ocean plastic waste polluters. And right away, I was kind of upset because the Philippines, which is where my family is from, is by far the biggest polluter on this data visualization. But as I tried to make sense of it, some other thoughts jumped out, like, where was this plastic waste coming from? I know they use a lot of plastic there, but I was very curious about that aspect. And also just by having quite a large population for a small country, there's about 113 million people there. It's small on this map, it's actually small compared to India or China or the US. So what's going on here? So it turns out it's not so simple. Like looking at other data, it turns out that when China banned plastic waste imports in 2018, due to contamination and poor waste management systems, this had regional and global repercussions. So you can see where that happened on the left. And then you can see on the right, for example, that Malaysia, which is third on the previous graphic as a contributor to ocean waste, their plastic waste import increased exponentially. In fact, a percentage of waste in these countries on this chart come from wealthier countries who have the resources to process their plastic waste and keep it out of the ocean, but also have the means to export their waste to these countries as well. So this graphic kind of lets some countries and people off the hook. For example, Europe by far is the region that exports the most plastic, and the US is the country that exports the most plastic. And you have this quote from Von Hernandez, who's the global coordinator of the nonprofit Break Free from Plastic. And they say rich industrialized countries that have the resources to deal with these materials in a responsible way have outsourced the disposal to countries that are less capable. Now, if we want an even more nuanced view, we find that even though there's big business in waste export, the export story isn't so easy. So Europe exports the most waste, but it's mostly exporting to other countries in Europe. Southeast Asia receives a lot of waste from Japan and other rich Asian countries. This is all to say there are no easy answers. So this problem space is a really good example of an area where systems thinking can be applied to analyze, to add nuance, and to acknowledge that there are many ways to navigate the problem. So you'll see I don't have any oh, here's the key insight, here's the magic bullet that will solve things here. So thinking about this issue in this way, you can see what I talk about as three key concepts of systems thinking. First, there's interconnectedness. So all of these countries and systems are intertwined. Poorer countries make income by accepting waste from industrialized countries. Then you have causality. So the relationship to the amount of ocean waste is tied to countries with fewer resources having poor waste management infrastructure. And exports from rich countries, that just contributes to that. And in addition, you see the effect of one country's policies throwing a wrench in the whole system and having radiating effects. And then lastly, there's wholeness. So that first chart was only telling part of the story. And systems thinking asks us to look at the system as a whole. So in this case, we find this to be a global problem, not just a domestic one. And then throw on top of that just things like colonial legacy, modern economic policy. And you have a huge system of incentives, policy, economics, causality that defines this broader problem space. So that illustration is just one example why thinking in systems matters. And we'll come back to those key concepts in a little bit. And, just to reinforce some of what Bernie was saying, my background is in design research and strategy. And I had worked for different consultancies such as Frog, Artifact, and Adaptive Path. And my focus over the past several years is that as a design consultant and an educator, I've been focused on developing tools and methods for other design practitioners to use to grow their skills in systems thinking, technology ethics, and also outcome-centered design, because I feel like these are questions I get a lot within my practice. And lately, particularly as a design educator, I've been thinking about the shortcomings of the design thinking approach, particularly in the narrow way that we apply it as practitioners. So thinking about the direct benefit of use to individual users. And in a world with what feels like increasing complexity in which we're constantly designing at scale, sometimes this approach seems to fall short, which is the reason I really like this comic, because I'm just like, I think there's many of us who kind of don't know what we're designing for anymore. So I think about three problems with narrow focus on users. So the user-centered design process does not acknowledge nor address potential harm. I talk in the book a little bit about an example of infinite scroll. So Asa Raskin, who is often credited or maybe blamed for the concept of infinite scroll, has said, one of my lessons from infinite scroll is that optimizing something for ease of use does not mean best for use. Best for the user or for humanity. And it just means like designing for delight does not necessarily lead always to good outcomes. Secondly, a user-centered approach limits the potential impact of design. So rather than using our creativity and empathy-driven practice to apply to bigger issues, we end up applying our skills to things like infinite scroll or adhering to maintaining status quo power and incentives. And then lastly, a user-centered process does not inherently take into account systemic forces. I write a little bit about how the designer Chris Alawa discusses the failure of the EXO laptop, the device from the famed one laptop per child initiative of the early 2000s. There's going to be people like, now I'm like revealing my age, like watching that laptop and just like wondering about it. The initiative failed basically for a myriad of reasons. One key reason is that designers and distributors did not understand the context of ownership. So the EXO laptop was rejected by adults in African economies because it focused on empowering one child as opposed to providing value to a family or entire community. So it was kind of missing that context and also the systemic forces at play within those economies. So thinking about systems forces us to consider beyond the direct benefit of use. And this means going beyond individual users, their context, and their use of products and services. So how can we consider the systemic impact of our work? I'm going to talk about the benefits of integrating systems thinking. I'll explain what it is, how to do it, and essentially like why take this approach. So let's talk about the definition. And to start, we can define what a system is. A system is more than sum of its parts. It may exhibit adaptive, dynamic, goal-seeking, self-preserving, and sometimes evolutionary behavior. This is from Donella Meadows, who wrote Thinking in Systems. If you haven't read it already, it's really a really good foundational book in systems thinking. So what she's saying here is that a system is an interconnected set of elements that is coherently organized in a way that it achieves something. And that's important to recognize. A system achieves something on its own, like whether that matches up with what people within the system are incentivized is kind of like an entirely different story. So again, the key concepts, we can think about them as interconnectedness, causality, and wholeness to kind of tell that story of a system. And we've all heard that metaphor as seeing the forest for the trees. So this basically describes the concept of wholeness. How do we see systems rather than our own specific area of focus? It's also a good metaphor for interconnectedness. So understanding shared relationships between the parts of the system. Roots are connected and they communicate. Animals reside in the system and are dependent on its ecology. And thinking about wholeness and interconnectedness allow us to expand our understanding of problem spaces. And it allows us to potentially have greater impact, like as designers. The last concept, which is causality, often is oriented around the cause and effect of problem solving. So Peter Senge, who wrote The Fifth Discipline, which is a classic on systems thinking and organizational design, he famously stated that today's problems come from yesterday's solutions. So essentially, the way we solve problems often results in unintended consequences, as well as a lack of understanding about the entire system. Solutions that merely shift problems from one part of a system to another often go undetected because those who solved the first problem are different from those who inherit the new problem. So a good illustration of why it's important to understand incentives is the Cobra effect. Maybe some folks here are familiar with it. It is an apocryphal story. Essentially, the idea is that 19th century British colonial army in India put a bounty on cobras. So the idea was bring a dead cobra in and collect money. And it worked for a while until people started breeding cobras to kill in order to collect the bounty, therefore being counterproductive to the band's initial intent. And essentially, systems thinking can help us recognize perverse incentives such as those, as well as radiating effects. Where we know for a fact this actually happened was in colonial Vietnam, where the French colonial army was trying to get rid of rats, and people started kind of like rat farming as a result. So that's what you would call like a perverse incentive. So that said, like kind of covering those concepts of systems thinking, let's talk about how to engage in it in general. So often because designers and design researchers practice at the intersection of like visualization and analysis, systems mapping is a really practical way to engage in systems thinking. So systems mapping is connecting concepts visually, of course. And as designers, we often engage in analysis, mapping exercises that express interconnectedness and wholeness. You know, we sometimes map things like ecosystems. Like this is an example of an ecosystem that I had worked on, which has sort of like comparative qualities of the hospital system within a country. And, you know, even things like service blueprints are a form of systems thinking as they're orchestrating connections and they articulate a service as a whole with multiple touch points. So for designers to engage in systems thinking, there's different forms of mapping. Some involve capturing the status quo, so understanding the problem space. And the other is using mapping to envision the future by mapping your interventions or solutions. So these are just, what's listed below are just like some frameworks that I use within my own practice, like stakeholder mapping, causal loop mapping, iceberg diagrams and fishbone diagrams, and then for envisioning the future, creating theory of change, and then futures wheel. So I'll share some of these in a moment. So let's start with causal loop mapping. This is oftentimes what is seen as the most iconic expression of systems mapping, which is a large map made up of causal loops. It's a good way of doing fairly thorough analysis and trying to understand as broad a system as possible. So it's made up of an atomic unit, the single causal loop, and these loops can then be put together to create a map and to understand root cause or a deep structure of the system. So using causal loop, you can see how cause and effect happen in a way that creates imbalances. These forces then create vicious cycles. So here's an example from this like actually really great book about economics history called Economics. It ends in an IX and it's like in a comic book format. So people buy cars, there's an increase in people buying cars, there's an increase in government and businesses building highways and parking spaces, and this leads to an increase in city sprawl, which leads to an increase in people buying more cars. And once you have an idea of different forces, you can start combining them. So for example, you see a vicious cycle happening on both sides of the connected loop. One of them is the increase that I just talked about, which is sprawl and car use, and another that has decreases. So a decrease, disinvestment in public transportation, and a decrease in city density. This is really like, could be a whole causal loop map in and of itself. Like if you can kind of like integrate some of the ideas around what is the root cause within the system. And that could also radiate out into like other concepts as well, so that you can kind of cover more ground in terms of what the problem space is. And you can again, like here's an example of one that's fairly simple and high level, but allows you to gain alignment with many different stakeholders. So this example is from David Peterstro's Systems Thinking for Social Change, and it's focused on the intersection of housing and rural community growth. Other types of system maps that are great for systems thinking and stakeholder alignment include iceberg mapping. So this type of map is great for understanding root cause. So it starts with events that are visible. For example, plastic accumulation in Southeast Asian countries, and works its way down to mental models, less waste in infrastructure in less developed countries, and exporting of waste as an acceptable practice. And again, the idea is not to do this on your own as a designer, but to engage various stakeholders. These kinds of maps in a way are affordances for your stakeholders to share their knowledge, expertise, and achieve alignment. So you're not going off and creating these on your own as a designer. You are doing them with other system stakeholders. So once you have an idea of the problem space through systems mapping, you can continue to use mapping to envision the future. The first way to think about potential interventions within the system, and I call them interventions rather than solutions because of that Peterson quote, where yesterday's solutions are today's problems. Or you can, it's just about like navigating the system, is coming up with interventions. Potential interventions that would solve the problem of the status quo, you need to consider different dimensions. So the STEEP framework is a good one for this. So sociocultural, technological, environmental, economic, and political. This kind of expands your thinking beyond, let's say you're just working in technology and you're thinking about like strictly digital technology solutions. You need to be thinking about the political landscape, or what are people's behaviors going to be like from a sociocultural perspective. And once you know the direction of possible solutions or interventions or initiatives, a theory of change is a good way to articulate a vision for a specific intervention. So on the left, you have inputs, activities, and outputs. These are what you do and what you produce. So let's take the example of vaccines. So these are what you do to produce vaccines, and the outputs are the produced vaccines themselves. In the middle, you have outcomes. So what do you want to design for? What are you measuring? For vaccines, you might be measuring how many people receive them. Or if your intervention is targeting a specific population, how many people in that population receive the vaccine? Outcomes are what happens when your activities and outputs have taken effect. And then lastly, there's impact. If the vaccines we're talking about are, let's say, a malaria vaccine, your impact would be the reduction of malaria, or more boldly, the eradication of malaria entirely. This is the effect you ultimately want to have with an intervention. And there's this concept called multifinality, where many different interventions should contribute to an impact. So if you're looking at the eradication of malaria, there's lots of different things that can be done to lead towards that impact. So now if you want to engage in more speculative thinking or figuring out how things might play out, you can also use a mapping tool called the futures wheel. So this is an example of futures wheel analysis of the COVID outbreak and some of the things that might follow. And this is from Barry O'Reilly's website. And what's interesting is, I think he worked on this like in the beginning of 2020, and it's interesting looking at it now and seeing like many of these things actually ended up happening. So this is great for understanding causality, potentially pinpointing unintended consequences, and again, gaining alignment with your stakeholders. Okay, so now that you have some mapping methods for engaging systems thinking, what are some of the benefits? So it helps us broaden the problem spaces in which we can use design as a tool for problem solving. So examples of spaces in which systems thinking is either currently used or could effectively be used. You see in the problem spaces, these are what we would describe as wicked problems: homelessness, healthcare systems, refugee crises, food insecurity, etc. And then you can also think in using kind of those mapping techniques around how you speculate things might play out, as being useful for things like disruptive technologies, so machine learning, etc. And it also helps consider unintended consequences more explicitly and helps be more deliberate about long-term change. So we sometimes deploy immediate reactive problem solving without a great deal of consideration for how these initiatives might play out long-term. So what we should be asking ourselves is, how can we ensure that when we're developing for a crisis, that what we're developing doesn't get potentially misused in the future? So I like this quote from Yuval Harari, where he says, temporary measures have a nasty habit about lasting emergencies, especially as there is always a new emergency lurking on the horizon. And this allows us to use systems thinking, which considers interconnectedness, causality, and holism to interrogate decisions that may have long-term systemic effects. So I think my question for all of you is, how do you see yourself using systems thinking? And you know, whether any of these tools might be useful within your work or in expanding your lens. And yeah, you can find me at Sheryl Cababa on LinkedIn and Twitter. And then, yeah, hopefully some of you will be able to delve into the book. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. That was amazing. And so much information. I think what we were planning to do now, I think Andrea was going to lead us through this, but we're going to do some breakout rooms. Let me just share my screen. These are the prompts we're going to put you in there. It's only going to be for 5 minutes, so please hang on, because after we come out of the breakout room, we'll do a Q&A, so you'll get a chance to ask Cheryl that pressing question you've had from all those what you learned today. So let's just quickly go into a breakout room, meet somebody new, and we're going to have 2 questions. So these are the 2 questions. You know, what's one takeaway from Cheryl's talk today? And number 2 is, how might you how might you add systems thinking to your work, or what was something that struck you that you might use? So Daphne is going to put you into breakout rooms right now, and we'll bring you back in 5 minutes. So just 5 minutes with some strangers, and then we'll then we can ask Cheryl some good questions, which we'll ask you to put into the chat. So Daphne, you're going to put us into the breakout rooms.
It says everybody's been invited to a breakout room. Is that true? Yes, it looks like the rooms are filling up. I did say to include the hosts. Are you not getting a message?
I don't think so.
I didn't get an invite either.
Oh, well.
Let's see if I can just find us and add us someplace.
And are you going to do the timer to bring us back, Daphne?
Oh, I will. Yes. And
Right.
you want me to do that in 10 minutes?
What? Five.
Yes. All right. Let me find you.
I'm happy to hang out here.
You might have to, because it's not.
That's
you're
okay.
not showing
That's
up in
fine.
my list of participants. Okay. Okay, 3 more.
Do you want me to do the timer and I'll just close all the rooms?
I got it.
Okay.
I'm gonna give him 3 more. Let me put myself on mute because of the construction.
I don't know if Christina is on, just says connecting to audio. So it seems like it's I'm going to put it back in the wait room because what do you think?
Sure, yeah, because it shows she's in room 2, but not joined yet, so I'm not sure.
Maybe
I'm going to bring them all back.
okay. All right, Andrea, you got
Yeah,
spotlight.
I see I've been spotlighted. Why is that, Bernie?
I'm trying to find Sophie too, and you'll be co-spotlighted.
Yeah, if you could, and Cheryl, we want you to maybe take some questions from the chat. Will you be able to do that?
Yeah, you want me to? I can read them out loud. The chat was empty for me right now. I don't see any questions. So if anybody wants to ask a question, if you don't mind retyping it, please do that.
Yeah, please. This is a great opportunity to get that pressing question from Cheryl. So I think we should spotlight Cheryl. Yeah. So put your questions into the chat. And I just
Sorry.
We also,
Sorry, Adam, wrong person.
Adam, have you got a question for Cheryl?
I see a hand raised, Marissa Reed.
Spotlight people.
Can we
I
get
hope,
Marissa to ask her question?
yeah, I think it's probably easier for me to ask versus
Yeah, do
typing. I'm currently in a place where I've done I've taken service design approaches and applied them to operations type activities. And I'm currently in a design operations position where we're unpacking a lot of systemic issues, I would say. However, I'm currently trying to, I'm going to say, sell leadership teams on why service design is important and why we should be taking these kind of approaches, like the human-centered design methodologies in general, to solve internal operations issues. Because we're a very cross-functional matrixed organization. Do you have any suggestions on maybe how to approach that or how to show the value of service design work?
Yeah, I mean, service design is kind of, it's fundamentally kind of like an organizationally oriented sort of tool set, right? Like you are considering the intersection of services with an organization and kind of like orchestrating what that experience is. So I feel like in many ways it naturally makes sense to kind of like use its methods to I guess point directly at an organization and how it functions. I think there are parallels. I mean, I've never thought about this specifically like in terms of service design, but I think in terms of like some of the frameworks that I've been talking about today, many of them were born of being used towards thinking about organizational change management. And so I think this kind of analysis lends itself really well. Like you want to be thinking about like, what are people incentivized by, for example, like not just in relation to products and services, but like within an organization and how it operates. How can you kind of like understand the boundaries of a system when it comes to an organization, and how it intersects with like the work that you're doing as an organization. I think it's like oftentimes management wants some sort of like clarity on what the return on investment would be for these kinds of methods. And I think there's always kind of like a good qualitative like argument for developing better understanding through analysis, because otherwise, like, what are executives like making their decisions based on? Probably assumptions. And so how do you kind of make the case by saying like, yeah, this gives you more clarity. It fundamentally gives you more alignment, especially if you are engaging with the people in the system who are going to be affected within the organization, then they might be able to better predict like what will happen, or at least be able to anticipate what might happen, rather than like driving directionally towards certain kinds of organizational change that might backfire on them, right? We see this happening a lot in things like, I know I've used some of these tools with organizations, for example, like the iceberg diagram, to better understand why there's so much attrition at a company. And it leads to kind of like some interesting assumptions jumping out about people's mental models and, you know, like how they're reacting to not just like their organizational decisions, but also like the economy that surrounds that organization. Futures Wheel is good for this too. Like I've used that for like organizations in terms of thinking about like, okay, we want to switch to, or we want everybody back in the office. Like, how is this going to play out? Like, what do we need to understand about the, like, sort of like the dynamics and forces here? And that helps them potentially kind of design initiatives that might prevent some of the unintended consequences of that decision, as well as like decide whether they want to do that at all. So I think it's kind of just thinking about the organization itself as a form of a product or something, and like kind of making the case, like if it were a product, like how would you use these tools and how would they be better in general than just making assumptions about it?
Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. I think what I'm hearing maybe is like mapping it back to a business case, something that the leadership team can consume and understand the reasoning why we're doing those kind of things. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl, for that answer for Marissa. I think we have a question. I think Praveen's question got answered by Bernie in the chat, but Melinda asked, when analyzing and mapping a problem area, how do you determine the boundaries of it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That comes up almost like every single time I talk about this. Is that we're all, so there's this concept in systems thinking called bounded rationality. So each of us is bound by our own sort of experiences and biases. And we kind of like we all understand the boundaries of like what we describe as a system in different ways, right? Like, for example, I do a lot of work in education. And if we're thinking about the stakeholders we're involving, students will look at will like think about the system very differently than say district administrators or researchers who are experts in this particular educational space. And I think my answer is like, because you're not as an individual meant to be navigating the system on your own, you shouldn't be in the position of being like, okay, this is what the system's boundaries are. You're doing this in collaboration with other stakeholders who have different ideas of where the bounds of the system are. So collectively, if your stakeholders and participants are diverse enough, then you should be able to have a pretty good idea of where's the sphere of interest in terms of like the boundaries of the system when we have this broader group of people who are involved. And I think that's a key point that I don't want to like, that I want to reemphasize, is just like, you're never going away and doing this work on your own. This is collaborative work that you're doing with multidisciplinary stakeholders. Many who have a pretty good understanding of the system. I always talk about how I love like involving academic researchers in my work, who are experts in the problem space, because they probably have a pretty good lens of like what the problem space actually is from a systemic lens. And then involving people who are really affected by the system. So who are the people who are like have very little power in the system? And oftentimes, for example, in education, that's students, right? And so making sure like you have this spectrum of folks that who are decision makers within the system, who are affected by the system, and who have a lens on the system are like, I think it's really important to think about engagement in that way.
Yeah, it sounds like if you need to choose the boundary, you can't do it by yourself. You need a diverse group of people. So yeah, thanks for that. Got time for a couple more questions. I think we're ending at one, right? Arun says, what could be potential use cases for systems thinking projects and enterprise projects?
Yeah.
Have you done any work with enterprises on this?
Yeah, I think I think if you think about like the area of like enterprise software, God, there's like so many different intersections of like organizations that you are designing for, like just like in terms of like who your users are is like kind of like an interesting system where you can kind of apply some of this thinking around and some of these frameworks around causal loops, or thinking about what's a theory of change, like as you think about enterprise level software that you're working on. There's lots of legacy involved. I think there's also like designers are actively working on pretty complex things like probably your enterprise organization has a design system. And so how do you use kind of systems thinking to understand the role of that design system and where it intersects with like the organizational need to support such an output? And so I think like kind of thinking about it in that way, that intersection of like your organization as an enterprise organization and the products and services that are your outputs. I think there's some pretty like diverse ways of potentially using it. I think it's hard for me in the moment to come up with anything like super specific, but I think like I've just been thinking, for example, about the design of design systems and articulating like the organizational support that is needed in order to kind of do it in a way to offset, like potential radiating effects of like not anticipating like how people will use it, etc. And like that conceptually can maybe help you make decisions about how to potentially design it or maintain it or what have you.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I don't know if you get, maybe if you can hear that child screaming in my microphone. Sophie, do you think you could take over the Q&A?
I can't actually hear a child screaming at all.
No, it's probably more distracting to Andrea than to us. We can't hear. I was thinking on an enterprise level, also you've got, and I started to use some of the frameworks in your book on a project that we just finished that had a big cultural impact, and to be able to think about what's, the surface, the top of the iceberg where things were, what was the impact and the events that were happening, but underneath there was this whole cultural context that we needed to understand in order to affect a solution, or not, as you call it, you don't talk about solutions, you talk about approaches, right? Mm-hmm. And when we started the project, it was about service design, but it quickly got beyond the bounds of beyond that quickly. And so we had to go look for different ways and different frameworks to think about how to talk about problems. So I think that's, to me, was the most exciting part, was just looking at some new frameworks and new ways to tackle these projects that go into deep into the organization, and there's no perfect outcome or solution at the end of it. You've got to kind of look at all the impacts. Sophie, you want to find another question for Sheryl? Or maybe
I don't see one in the chat, I don't think. Does anyone else have a question? Was there one missing here? I was kind of scrolling through.
I do see one about that is interesting to me, which is just as you mentioned, there are shortcomings.
Okay, that one.
Design thinking.
Yeah.
What are the perceived shortcomings of systems thinking, and how do you address that?
Okay, interesting. Yeah, that one, I missed that one. Okay.
I think one of the reasons that systems thinking feels intimidating to a lot of design practitioners, including myself, as I, I've integrated into my own practice, is that there are times where it feels like we're abstracting away from like sort of like the humanistic way of kind of like thinking about problem solving, because you're thinking about forces, you're thinking about, how forces intersect, and it like forces you to kind of like think at a different altitude, maybe about like things like people's collective behavior. And I feel like there's some friction there for me. Like it's uncomfortable. Like as a design researcher, I'm oftentimes tasked with like telling stories about people's like experiences or their sort of context or what have you. And I think sort of like the level of systems analysis feels like it abstracts away from that. And so I think this is where it's really nice to have like the intersection of systems thinking and design thinking, even acknowledging the shortcomings of design thinking, is just like, how do you kind of keep that humanistic lens, but be able to engage in this level of analysis that gives you a broader perspective as to how to better navigate a problem space.
There's a question here about has systems thinking been applied to JEDI, and the acronym is Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion.
Yes. So my practice at Substantial is primarily focused on equity-centered design. So basically kind of thinking about using design to increase equity, specifically in education. And so systems thinking is really important part of this, because I think you have to acknowledge not just how systems operate, but the layers of systemic harm that that essentially target specific populations, right? And so we use this kind, like, I think it goes hand in hand. There's a really like Venn diagram for my team around equity-centered design and systems thinking. Like these are both things we have to engage in every project. And part of that is that you're looking to kind of like surface what can't always be seen. And so the idea that there's nuance and that there's multi-finality, which, is kind of like another concept in systems thinking, which talks about how there's different potential solutions that can lead to a type of impact. And also seeding, I think part of this too is like understanding your positionality as a design practitioner, that you hold certain privileges within the process, within decision-making, that others don't have. And part of like what you need to be doing is to actually kind of cede some of that power to those who may be more affected by the system itself. So, I mean, all of those things are kind of connected. And like, I think when it comes to, I feel like I've heard that term, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. I think there are many principles, for example, of like inclusive design that get sort of integrated within our work as we kind of think about the systemic impact within the problem spaces that we're working in.
Seems like system thinking is perfect for JEDI kinds of problems, which are very complicated and need multiple stakeholders, and also just thinking about, like you said, about the people that are most impacted by something, by a system. I think, have we got another question?
Sophie, are you talking? Looks like you're on mute.
Sorry. There's another question, it looks like here about, I wonder, are there any overlaps? This is Marlene. You see between design thinking and systems thinking, or even ways they can be used together towards business and or societal challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's in many ways, that in many ways kind of describes my own practice. In that it's like, I'm still a design researcher by nature. We still like do research with and co-design with people who you might consider end users or end beneficiaries within a system, right? And we hinge a lot of our work in that realm. But then we also intersect it with this kind of analysis with those stakeholders, as well as like other experts within the system. So we engage a lot of subject matter experts in our education projects, for example. And many of our outputs are really like sort of like visually oriented. And I think the intersection with design thinking, I actually have a framework in the book where I talk about like, these are the points where systems thinking is useful. So you have the design thinking framework, which is oftentimes described as empathize or understand, define, ideate, prototype, and test. And the way that I integrate that with like a systems thinking mindset is like, you know, you have to think about before you go into that process, you're expanding your mindset, and then you're kind of imagining the possibilities. And then some of your solutions, whatever, interventions might take the form of a design thinking process. And then others might actually go into other spaces like policy or, you know, what other, just like basically there's loads of other people who have different types of expertise, and they might be able to execute on other kinds of interventions in other ways. And the idea is that, yeah, again, that leads into that idea of multi-finality, where it's like, okay, there's some things that have gone through the design process. There's other things that have they maybe gone through things like the regulatory process or what have you. And the idea is that they should lead to the outcomes that you're intending to as like you're analyzing the system. So I think like that's kind of like how I see it, is it expands your ability to conduct analysis as to where the design thinking process can then sit.
That's a great answer.
Yeah, thank you.
Just
I
so
really,
bringing together those two worlds in that way, you can really see it. Yeah.
yeah,
So on that note, it is 1 minute before we're going to say goodbye, but we'd love for everyone, Bernie sent out a survey, so if you could give us feedback. And I want to thank Sheryl for sharing the book and answering all the questions and you know, participating. So really appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been really fun.
Yeah,
So much. It really was so good. So good. Read the book, buy the book.
Yes. Thank you
We
so
put
much.
that, well, we'll send a 15% off code to everybody through Eventbrite, maybe. Did we get the coupon code from the publisher or
Yes.
not?
I actually, do you want me to tell you what it is? It's like,
yeah, let's do
people,
that.
it's,
Yeah.
hold on, I just need to make sure. It's Cababa, CABABA -SDN. And it's good for 15% off if you go to the Rosenfeld Media website to purchase it.
Cababa-SDN, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, wait, and I can share the link in the chat.
And if you buy the book from Rosenfeld, you can get the audio, the PDF version of the book as well. So you get the electronic copy as well as the physical copy. And it is really, really helpful. And when you find service design only takes you so far, systems thinking will expand your mind, blow your mind, and help you really tackle some much more complicated projects with your clients and with your coworkers. And with that, thank you very much. You're welcome to return to your normal scheduled business.
Thanks, everyone. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
Take care.
All right.
I'm definitely going to stop the recording.
Yes.
All right, thank you.